Thanks for tuning in to the Mission Matters podcast, where we feature successful, mission-driven leaders committed to creating a positive change in the world. Our mission with this channel is to inspire other leaders by providing industry insights, new ideas, and inspiring stories from the pros.
All right, well, hello again. Paul Feith here, host of the show where I interview business leaders heading up mission-based organizations, always leading from the heart and making a difference in their communities. I'm also excited today that you probably noticed if you're watching this on video that we're in a studio this time as opposed through Zoom. So I'd like to thank the Sound Lab from the Matrix Club for providing the sound studio for us. Awesome studio. I don't know if you can get a wide shot of us here, but it's pretty cool. Yep. So thank you. Sometimes you just like to have a podcast in person, right?
Always the best.
So I have with me Rick Lochner, President and CEO of RPC Leadership Associates. You came back. That's awesome.
Yeah, I had fun the first time.
Awesome. Well, Rick is an accomplished coach, facilitator, keynote, and workshop speaker, author of not 5, not 6, but 7 books. I haven't written my first one yet. And foremost, a leader. His vision is to help nonprofit leaders, business owners, corporate leadership teams, and individual professionals make leadership a way of life. So thanks for being here, Rick. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Paul.
So for those that are just listening for the first time, why don't you just give us a quick update bio about you?
Sure. So I've been in the leadership business probably most of my life. Went through at a high school, I went to the military academy at West Point, and by most people's measures, the military academies are really the Ivy League of leadership. Although the education is great, but really they focus on leadership. And so coming out of that experience, throughout my 11-year military career, a 13-year career at Sprint, and a couple of short stints at an entrepreneurial venture, and then switched industries from telecom to healthcare. As I look back and as I've kind of dissected, how I did what I did and where success came from, it really came from leadership. And, in that space when I left Sprint, I was looking for a board position to step into because now I wasn't traveling as much. And so I was looking for some of that board experience. I had done some previously, parish council, scouting, etc. And I wanted to get back into that. And so I was fortunate enough to find, between then and now, 4 different boards. You and I served on one with the local chamber, and 4 different board experiences. And, once again, when you look at what made that work, especially as we navigate a couple of recessions, some political unrest and that sort of thing, it really boiled down to leadership. So hence the vision of our organization is making leadership a way of life. So it's all about being a leader as opposed to doing leadership.
Being versus doing. And you 13 years, 11 years. And how long with RPC?
We just celebrated 15 years this year. So, yeah.
A lesson to the youngins out there who hop from job to job every 2 or 3 years. I don't know. There's something to be said about your longevity in some of these places.
11 years in the Army, had 7 jobs.
Okay.
13 years at Sprint, had 5 jobs. So there's hopping around, but you can do it within a large organization if you play your cards right.
Mobility.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, thinking versus doing. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay. So oftentimes people get caught up in reading leadership books. And, this is how you do it.
Sure.
Right? This is how you become this leader or that leader. And what most of them forget is that you have to internalize that. You have to, it has to be part of your attitude, not just your behavior. And so at networking events, when people ask us, so what do we do? I said, well, we're in the attitude adjustment business. Because my whole premise is that when we get leaders to think differently about what it's like to lead in the 21st century, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, then the doing really becomes natural because you're already thinking like a 21st century leader.
So it's not thinking versus doing.
Oh, no.
It's thinking to do different.
Well, in the simple psychology of it all, as you think you do, right? Our subconscious is almost 90% of the math. So almost 90% of what we do is a function of our subconscious. So if we can reprogram our subconscious to think differently, the doing really just follows.
Well, I think that anybody who's written or seen Tony Robbins' seminar, right, kind of knows that he's all about the linguistics and training your thought process.
Exactly right.
So that makes a lot of sense. So you think different to do different. And my notes here say something about social enterprise and how that relates to that.
And that's a great lead in and before I get into that, think of the reverse of how many times we've tried to do different without thinking different. In a social enterprise, as it pertains to nonprofit leaders, is one of those examples. So when I work with nonprofit leaders, which is about a third of our business, when I work with nonprofit leaders, we introduce the idea of a social enterprise versus a traditional charitable agency. And the difference is a typical charitable agency will look at all the grant money that they're going to get, kind of plan to see, maybe they've got a couple of multi-year grants from foundations and the like. And then they'll say, well, how can we operate within that? Whereas a social enterprise will say, here's what we need to accomplish. Where do we get the money? And so it's a different way of thinking about how you approach your business. We are a business. We're just a business with a special tax status. But that's an example of how you think differently. I saw a report back in 2019 that said 1 out of 7 typical community-based charity organizations are insolvent. They just don't know it yet.
1 out of how many?
7.
Jeez. Okay.
Right? Because they're thinking, in my opinion, they're thinking like a typical.
Because they're not thinking.
Well, they're not thinking the right way. Let's put it that way. They haven't adapted their thinking to the 21st century. The reality of, look, nobody's giving away feel-good funding anymore. People, foundations are holding agencies more accountable to how they're spending the funds.
Of course, yeah.
And so you no longer have that. Plus, we have a different generation of donors, individual donors, who are contributing to very different things. Whereas baby boomers might have contributed to religious organizations and the like, the millennials are more apt to donate to pets or animals, animal agencies, and that sort of thing.
So this is a huge little nugget of information here, because you're not just talking about a better business practice. You're talking about a way for growth.
Sustainable growth.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, you haven't written any books, but you've done the covers of all my books.
That's how you brought that up. I didn't write any books.
Well, but I'm giving you credit here because you did the covers of all my books.
Okay.
But I bring that up because you know that a big thing for me in our practice is sustainability.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really the key. Is you don't want to be insolvent and not know it. Right. You want to be able to run a sustainable nonprofit organization so that you continue to serve the people that need the help the most.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, that's the reason why they're in business in the first place.
Right, but you can only run a business so far on pure passion. At some point, you have to think like a business leader. You have to think and act as if this is because it is. You have operations, you have marketing, you have sales/development.
Right.
But you have all these functions that have to work together in order to achieve the goals that you want to, in order to be sustainable. Because relying on foundation money or relying on individual giving, it's a roller coaster. Right?
You don't have any guarantees.
You have no guarantees of 1 year to the next, other than maybe you get lucky and you get a couple of foundational grants that, maybe a 2 or maybe even a 3-year grant. But after that 3 years, it's going to be a down year.
Yep.
You know that.
So my takeaway for this is that think outside your grants and your funding, come up with a plan, 3-5 year, and build funding around that.
Exactly. And so one of the other main differences is one of the traps that nonprofits and some for-profits get into is they build their budget and then they build their operations. Build your operational plan and then build your budget around it so that it forces you to think outside the box, as you just said.
So is it safe to say have an organization, come up with $1 million marketing budget and then figure out how to fund it later?
I see where this is going.
Scratch that. That was a little self-serving, sorry. Okay, so you do all that.
Yes.
And I like that because that's thinking about funding outside of your grants and donors is really the social enterprise model, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have that now. Let's say you have that in place, or you're positioning yourself to get that in place.
That's your plan. Yeah.
What's next? I mean, is the story the next? Like, what is your story?
Well,
does it matter?
It does matter. It matters a lot because the evolution of storytelling, of marketing, if you will, has evolved from here's how much service we provide to what is now required is here's the impact that we're having. So one of my favorite examples is food banks. I've worked with probably 5 food banks here in the Chicagoland area. And in one particular case, and in all 5 of them, rightly so, or the growth is, hey, we keep giving more food away, regardless of the need, but we keep giving more food away. So we're essentially solving the hunger issue, at least in the short term.
Usually measured by people or pounds.
Either which way.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So this one particular food bank I was working with, they, like the rest, were giving away more food. Well, it also happened that I was working with a community that was on the receiving end of that food. And I found out from the community they were throwing a third of it away because it wasn't cultural, part of their cultural diet, spoilage, just a myriad of reasons. So what impact was that food bank having? They were, by traditional metrics, their story was, look at all the food we're giving. But the impact was, and they didn't even know it, was we're really not having the impact we thought we were.
Right, because they weren't measuring the waste.
They weren't measuring the impact. They were measuring the input, not the output,
okay,
if you will.
Wow, well, that's interesting. So is it a matter of updating your KPI or metrics in your annual report, or how's that?
Well, metrics are certainly part of it, but it's what you measure, right? And the only thing that matters is impact. What impact are you having on the world? Think of it as, so what? So you gave away X hundreds of pounds of food. So what? How did that move the needle for, it certainly solves a short-term problem of hunger. And I'm not discounting that at all.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we feed people. Well, let's put it this way. As I told another food bank that I worked with, whose mission is to end hunger, you don't end hunger by feeding people. You end hunger by finding out why they're hungry in the first place.
Okay. Well, that's certainly sound.
Oh, it was met with a pregnant pause by the board.
Well, because their mission is to feed people, not to find out why they're hungry, I guess, right?
But their vision is to end hunger.
Through feeding people. Maybe that's where the disconnect is, you think?
Well, but see, that's where you can see the disconnect between traditional measurement of what I'm providing versus what impact am I having.
Sure. I think what speaks to that also is a little transparency, right? Because I just saw a report that somebody was feeding 3 times more than they were last year, right? And it was measured by, I think, pounds.
Okay.
Excuse me. And I'm thinking, okay, in my head, I made the leap. There's a greater need now than there ever was. But it's not so transparent when you have numbers like that, because I'd never even considered how much of that was wasted or inappropriate to their cultural diets, or
sure,
what the impact was.
Right.
I made a leap. So it's kind of a little bit of a marketing, but not necessarily transparent. So kind of like that. And does it answer the so what? So you fed 8,000 pounds or 20,000 pounds.
Sure.
Or what does that mean to our community?
And when you can answer that, when your story says that, I guarantee, because I've seen it happen, your donations go up, your partnerships with others will increase, and people now see you as a sustainable organization because you're having impact. You're not just doing stuff.
And that's super important, right? Funding is the engine.
Name of the game.
Yep. Name of the game.
Yep.
So that answers a so what. and I don't know if this is like a marketing perspective or not, but the next point you want to make of the 5 is, what's your story?
And well, it's what your story and who are you telling it to?
Or maybe how you're telling it.
Yeah, how are you telling it? So, we now live in a world where how we tell stories is through social media in large part.
Yep.
Right. So it's, I have an example of, I was giving a presentation to a philanthropic network of nonprofit leaders, and a baby boomer executive director stood up and said, we've got this celebrity coming in to host our gala and the like. And that was part of the story, right? We've got this celebrity. Well, a millennial stood up in the front of the room and turned around and said, if I want to connect with a celebrity, I can do that in 30 seconds on social media. Go. Yeah. Oops. So the whole point is stick with the impact and then use all the available channels to reach people that you never would have met or reached before. Social media is a very efficient way to do it if you do it right? Because you can reach people that normally wouldn't.
Sure.
It's shocking to me how many boards that I work with that arguably are, most of them are in the 50 plus age range.
Okay.
So I'll ask them, how many around the table are following your organization's Facebook page?
Their own organization that they're on the board?
Their own organization that they're on a board.
My.
And I maybe, 40% on average.
Well, that's a sad tale.
But that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, not just social media too. There's other digital channels. We used to, and maybe the pandemic, this was brought out by the pandemic. We used to kind of visit the digital channels, social media, email marketing, advertising on through programmatic or whatever. But we kind of live there now. That's where everything is, right? And so it's become such an important channel if you want to extend your reach and build engagement.
Well, and the other part of thinking differently, of course, is not undervaluing the impact that the millennials, who are now, the oldest millennials are now 42, and negating or dismissing the fact that probably over the next 10 years or so, 8 to 10 years, there's estimated to be north of $40 trillion in wealth transfer to younger Gen Xers and millennials.
Trillion with a T.
T.
Wow.
As in tango. Right. So, they may not have the wealth now. So, statistically, the baby boomers still own most of the wealth, but that wealth is going to transfer greatly over the next 10 years. Right. And if you're not looking at, do you have millennials on your board? Do you have millennials in your staff, in your donor base? Then you're really not playing the long game the way you should. And social media is a great way to reach them.
It sure is. So social enterprise, having your story make an impact or telling your impact as opposed to some other KPI, like so what, answer the question.
Right.
How are you telling your story through those digital channels? Don't ignore millennials. And then we're on to our 4th point, which is who are your partners?
Exactly. And this is one of my favorites. There is no nonprofit out there that can survive in the long term without some relationship with the for-profit community. And I'll stand by that statement until somebody gives me a better argument, which nobody has of yet.
Is it more of like subsidizing?
Not subsidizing, it's partnerships, in the truest sense. Whether it's, so instead of thinking of a donation or let's take a broader. When I say donation, most people think money. But when we think of a donation of time, talent, or treasure, right?
You're in kind, yeah.
Yeah, the big 3. How are you nurturing that so that it's a relationship and not an event? So let's say a company has a policy where they'll let employees volunteer for 2 days every quarter with a nonprofit. And so they do, and thanks for the 2 days, have a nice life. There's no nurturing, there's no, hey, how do we build a relationship? So here's a couple of examples of how an organization I've been a part of now for 15 years has been able to do that. I belong to a leads team as part of the local chamber.
Okay.
12 years ago, we held a fundraiser for a local nonprofit, which I know you're familiar with, Kids Matter, and we raised $5,000
Great organization.
in a parking lot.
In a parking lot.
Bags tournament in a parking lot.
I remember that. Yeah.
And so here today, now we're raising well over $100,000. Well over for because of the relationship that we've had through that entire 12 years. We've had people on the board of directors from the team. We've had people on the advisory board from the team. I'm on that advisory board. We've been a big contributor to their gala, right? So we have a relationship. And as a matter of fact, when situations have come up where people have tried to separate us, we pushed back. We said, no, we're staying together.
Right, because they want you to spread the wealth a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you want to spread the wealth and get others to copy what we've done, but don't separate us, don't divorce us for the sake of others. The other example, same group. For many years, I was on the board of Literacy to Page, which is a local adult literacy organization. And we created a program called Letters for Literacy. And so for basically a donation from the businesses, we created through a relationship with a printing company, right? A for-profit business. We created posters that these businesses could put in their window that showed that they are supporting adult literacy, because for every dollar invested in adult literacy, the community returns $33 back. So again, that's an impact measurement.
Sure.
And so those are the kinds of examples where if nonprofits are doing it right, they're building relationships with for-profit businesses. They're not just taking donations from.
Well, Rick, you've inspired me. I am going to make a plug here. I'll decide whether I'm going to cut it later, but I don't think I am. As a marketing agency for nonprofits, we donate to 10 plus organizations a year. And we typically, our budget is somewhere around 1% of our gross revenue. So last year it was, how much was last? Almost 17,000, but I think we actually donated close to 25,000. We spread it over 10 organizations. And what I normally get from, and it's almost like I expect it, is thank you for your donation. And then the next event, there might be 2 or 3 a year. Right. There might be 1 a year.
Sure.
They ask for that donation again. And there's no nurturing in between. There's one organization that I'm going to plug that does so much nurturing. I can't wait to donate. In fact, I might donate early this year for the tax write-up, but also because I love the organization. That's the Paramount Arts Center, which is the River Edge group.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Which you've been a guest there, of mine there.
Yep.
The nurturing that goes on and the in-between events that are comped or not comped, I mean, it's just such a pleasure to be thanked in that way and nurtured in that way. And it's one of the few organizations that'll say that does it right. And I wish other organizations would take note. So there's my plug. I'm going to keep it in.
All right. But it's another great example of the partnership and that relationship that helps them, helps you. Everybody wins.
Yeah, everybody wins for sure. And it just builds it up and goes to you. It makes the organization thrive.
Yeah.
So I cannot think of a better way than to partner with a for-profit company. So I have not been able to crack that code either. So you let me know if anybody does. I doubt it.
I certainly will.
No nonprofit can live unto itself. So then that brings us to our last and final point, which is how do you measure success?
Well, we've touched on that a little bit already when we talk about impact, right? I mean, the first step is obviously choosing the metrics that matter and then holding yourself accountable to those metrics. So I mentioned Literacy to Page. We had that metric that we got from an A.T. Kearney research report. $1 invested yields $33 back. And so we built an entire marketing strategy around where does that money go? We put a story to it. And we measured how many new people we were talking to, not just how many people we were talking to. We looked at nurturing. If somebody gave $500 last year, can they give $750 this year? Right? Those kinds of things that show that we're focused on growing, and that's kind of easy to do if you've done the fourth bullet, and you have those relationships.
Right.
To say that Team B2B had no problem going back to the well each and every single year for 12 years or for the 5 years that they supported Literacy to Page, it wasn't one of the easiest asks going. So there's a couple of parts to it. One is obviously measuring what matters the most, but then socializing those metrics with the board, with the staff, to make sure that everybody's being held accountable to those metrics. So I'll give you an example. As a board president, I challenged everybody on the board to tell the Literacy to Page story to 3 people that have never heard it before.
Oh, yeah.
Every month. And sometimes it hit, sometimes it didn't. But every board meeting, we went through that metric. Who'd you talk to? How'd it go? What'd you learn? And so it's by having that metric in place, you set that expectation that even though boards are volunteers, if you raise your hand to say, yes, I want to be on this board, then there's an accountability that goes with that.
Of course.
The only way accountability works is if you have metrics to set that expectation with.
Sure. I mean, I'm of the ilk that board members should be fundraising, and they should be spreading the word of their mission and vision. And that's a great metric because you're actually putting some parameters around it. So you measure that.
Sure. Well, we called it a friend-raising metric.
Okay. Love that.
Because it plays off the philosophy that people don't give money to strangers. So
True.
They might, but most often than not, people don't give money to strangers. So the whole idea is to make friends first, and then we can see where they might want to fit into the conversation.
Sure. I mean, I've seen fundraising plans where it was all about the relationship and don't do the ask until you have a relationship. And that could take 6 months. It could take a year.
Absolutely.
But it's a longer game.
Yep. But it's a sustainable game.
Mm-hmm. And a higher dollar value.
Absolutely.
Or, like you said, treasure or talent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you've said it all. I mean, those are 5 great pillars of thinking like a 21st century leader.
Yeah.
In this digital age.
It's just a very different world for nonprofit leaders than it was in the past century. So now 23 years in, it's just a very different world. And it's, when I hear people say, well, we've been doing it this way for 20 years or 30 years or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
My question is always back, so which 5 are relevant?
Yeah.
Right. And so isn't that really the whole idea as a leader, is you have to stay relevant as the world continues to evolve. And that's no truer than in the nonprofit space through recessions. Again, through here in Illinois, we went through a political governorship that really cratered a lot of nonprofits in an effort to balance a budget. So, how to navigate with a pandemic, obviously, but it's the ones that do the things that we just talked about that will come out on the other end in the front of the line.
Right. Trim the inefficiencies, get rid of the things that aren't working. And I think these 5 points are really a good playbook, if you will.
Mm-hmm. It is by far the hardest job in the leadership business, leading a nonprofit.
I've heard that so many times. Yeah.
It's probably, when I wrote the missing piece for nonprofit leaders, I think it's in the first 2 or 3 sentences where I make that point. And I've been in the leadership business a long, long time. And I stand by that statement too. It's one of the hardest jobs in the leadership business.
Right.
So,
and so many people
don't make it harder.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So many people I talk to who left the corporate world to do sort of the easy gig.
Oh, yeah.
Find out very quickly that it's not the easy gig. Well, Rick, you coach a lot of nonprofit leaders.
I do.
For sure. And you've helped them. Everyone that you've coached has been in a better place since. So any parting thoughts for future potential nonprofit leaders?
Make leadership a way of life.
Love it. Succinct.
Think it point. And become the leader that the organization needs.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, even a second time, no less. So I do appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
Till next time, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Mission Matters podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.